It's almost time, Robert. Shall we wait a couple of more minutes or what?
I would start on time.
Well, then it's just the moment to start. So welcome everyone to this event organized by the Royal Dutch Economic Association. My name is Laura Spierdijk. I'm a professor of financial engineering at the University of Twente, and I've organized this event on behalf of the KVS. Now, the timing of the event is really well because last week I became the victim of name spoofing with emails from some obscure email address that were sent on my behalf to colleagues, also with my name in it. And these emails even asked for money. So although the economic impact of this name spoofing was zero, fortunately, this certainly does not hold for other cyber events. And that's essentially today's topic. So we have three speakers who will each give a 20-minute talk, followed by room for discussion and questions. And the three speakers are Bastiaan Overvest from CPB, Abista from the University of Twente, and Ralf Verhoeks from the Dutch Central Bank. Now, Bastiaan will start, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And I will start with sharing my screen. I think I should share this screen. Yeah, can you see my screen? Just to check. Okay, great. Well, yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Laura, thank you for organizing this meeting and inviting me to give a presentation. It's really an honor for me to be here and to contribute to this meeting of the KVS. So yeah, as you said, Laura, I work at the CPB, usually mostly on matters related to COVID-19. Before 2021, however, I did, together with some colleagues, research and policy analysis on the economics of cybersecurity. And in this presentation, I gratefully make use of that work. So the first question that a traditional economist might ask is, what can economists contribute to cybersecurity? Why is there even such a thing as the economics of cybersecurity? Well, to be honest, I wondered this myself when I started a few years ago working on this topic. After all, economists tend to study things such as inflation, employment, the economy. So to understand what economists can contribute, we should go back to the core of economics, which is the study of behavior or choices under situations of scarcity and uncertainty. So in that sense, in my view, the economics of cybersecurity is fundamentally about choices on cybersecurity. Well, that begs the question, what is cybersecurity? According to some people, it is a business fad or a vague term. A simple description that I use is simply that cybersecurity is about prevention and mitigation of damages that result from failure or abuse of a digital system. So if you translate that to economics, it simply means that cybersecurity, or the economics of cybersecurity, is about investment in reliability. So how do firms invest? And economists can analyze those investment choices with standard economic tools, as they have done earlier in the history of economics. In my view, the economics of cybersecurity has its roots in the economic analysis of nuclear conflict. Think, for instance, of the pioneering work of Thomas Schelling in this field. And today, the economics of cybersecurity is part of a cross-disciplinary field with computer scientists and legal scholars. Economists study topics such as privacy, protocol adoption, the cost of incidents, or software quality. In the next 15 minutes or so, I will give a very short tour around. I hope you enjoy it. So let's look at the investment choice at the most basic level in an almost ideal world. And I say almost because, well, apparently for some reasons, computers still may break down. We have a firm that tries to maximize profits, and its profit function is given here. It's the most basic profit function that I could come up with. Its profits are given by price times quantity minus the cost of producing the quantity. And the second part is new. That's the expected cost of an IT failure. And the IT failure occurs with probability 1 minus S. F is the cost of a failure. And the firm can try to lower the probability of an IT failure by investing in cybersecurity. And the cost of cybersecurity is given by CS. So a rational firm will set an optimal security level such that the marginal costs equal the expected marginal benefit. And if we exclude corner solutions, this means that 100% security is not optimal. A rational firm accepts that things can go wrong. So this is the first, I hope, useful lesson for practical applications. But of course, in the real world, investment choices are not so trivial. So let's consider settings that are a bit more realistic. So think, for instance, of the case where the social costs of incidents are larger than the private costs of incidents. This is about externalities or there could be a public good value of security. And another maybe more realistic aspect could be that the true private costs of incidents are larger than the perceived private cost of incidents. And in my view, this relates to issues of bound rationality and information problems. And these more realistic features, you could call them market failures, could be a justification for government involvement in the cyber domain. And I will say a bit more about externalities and bound rationality in the next few slides. So start with externalities. They are, of course, everywhere, and also in the cyber domain. In the cyber domain, an externality can happen when an infected system attacks or infects another system. This has happened in the real world. I think Laura was the victim of a attack that also had an externality in it. WannaCry is an example of a large-scale ransomware attack in 2016, when a piece of malware that is believed to be associated or developed by North Korea attacked around 200 computers worldwide. And it worked such that infected computers infected other computers. And the infected computers were encrypted, which means that the users of those computers were no longer able to use those systems. So it was a very costly attack. Next, I have a stylized map of the infections of WannaCry in 2016. So it happened basically everywhere. So when there are externalities in cyber, what does it mean for the investment decision of individual firms? Should they invest more in cyber? Intuitively, you would say yes. And indeed, until recently, the predominant view in the literature was yes, security externalities lead to underinvestment in cybersecurity measures. To understand why there is underinvestment when you have a case of security externalities, consider, well, suppose you live in an apartment block and you consider to install a sprinkler system. If you do so, that will prevent a fire to spread from your apartment to your neighbors. Well, this is good for your neighbor, and if you do not fully weigh their benefits into your investment decision, there is a positive externality. And chances are that you do not install a sprinkler system, even if it would be socially optimal to do so. Well, here's a very stylized example that I borrowed from Acemoglu and Malikian and Ozdaglar. They show a very simple network consisting of 3 nodes or agents, and each agent can invest in security. So they can invest in cybersecurity, or they can install a sprinkler system. And when a agent invests in security, it has a lower probability that it gets infected or it gets a fire. However, once by some probability the node is still infected, it could spread like a virus or like a fire to its neighbors. And in this network, the authors show that in the social optimum, each node invests the same in social security, and that happens to be higher than what you see in a symmetric Nash equilibrium, in which nodes or agents do not take into account the positive security externality. So this result suggests that the market fails because firms invest too little. A recent study by Acemoglu et al., however, shows that this result does not generalize, unfortunately. They show that the lower investment by a node increases the investment of others through what they call a strategic substitutes effect. And this effect may result in overinvestment, and they show that it can happen in asymmetric equilibria of symmetric networks, in asymmetric equilibria of symmetric networks, or in asymmetric networks. To understand this result, so they thoroughly prove it mathematically, but to understand it intuitively, go back to the apartment complex example. Now suppose that your neighbor does not install a sprinkler system. Then that decision may impact your behavior as well. You may want to take extra precautions because of the higher risk of a fire that spreads from your neighbors to your apartment. So that's the strategic substitutes effect. And again, they have a nice illustration of this effect in the same network that I showed before, which is here. So this just illustrates the strategic substitutes effect. Again, the social optimum is that everybody invests 4/9, but in the asymmetric equilibrium of this symmetric network, in the aggregate combined, the nodes invest too much. So there's overinvestment in security. And for me, the takeaway is that a priori, it is unclear whether economic actors invest too little, too much, or just about optimally in cybersecurity. And I think it's still an open and mostly an empirical question whether firms invest too little or too much. And clearly the existence of only of positive security externalities is insufficient to justify a role for government in this regard. But let's move to bound rationality, as I promised. So according to the NCSC, the Dutch cybersecurity center, but also according to many other observers, many firms are reluctant to take basic security measures, such as strong passwords or a fast patching policy of software vulnerabilities. So that could indicate according to those people, a problem of awareness. So some firms seem to be insufficiently aware of the risks in the cyber domain. There is some evidence for this. If you look at this table, and here we use information from KVS. It is a list of possible cybersecurity measures. And what you see here is a distinction between companies with, well, small companies with 2 to 5 employees and large companies. And clearly, well, most firms take antivirus software, but more sophisticated measures are not taken by small firms. So this confirms the observation of the NCSC and others. And indeed, it suggests that some firms are less aware of cybersecurity risk. The follow-up question is, will that impact their business results? So I would think that firms that invest more because they are more aware are more profitable on average. That's, however, not what we see in the data. For this graph, taken from a discussion paper with my colleagues Rami Eldadiri and Milena Dinkova, we merged survey data on cybersecurity measures from CBS with balance sheet data for around 8,000 firms in the Netherlands. And what we see is that firms that invest very little in security, I'm not sure whether you can see my pointer, those firms have more or less the same profitability as firms that invest a lot in cybersecurity. So based on this, I don't think you can conclude that firms should invest more in security, that they are bound to be rational. Maybe they are, but it's not apparent from this piece of data. So again, there is not a good argument for more government involvement, only because of the probability that firms may be insufficiently aware. So the government obviously is active in the cyber domain. What does government do? Maybe it's good to have an overview of that. So this is a stylized summary of the main, not all, the main activities of the Dutch government in the cyber domain. First one is the provision of information about vulnerabilities and exploits. The government does it mainly via the NCSC, and it can be very helpful for firms and other organizations that have vital or essential infrastructure. The second critical task of the government is to enforce property rights. And finally, of course, government is also responsible for the security of its own public IT. I think that overall, these are indeed economically justifiable actions of the government. It makes sense that we do this. I think that perhaps Ralph Hoeks of DNB, who is the second speaker, can perhaps say more about the last point. I would like to say a bit more about enforcement of property rights via criminal law in the next slide. Here, maybe it takes some time to look at the picture. Here we have two diagrams about criminal law enforcement for two types of crime. For cyber crimes, in Dutch it's called computervredebreuk, and for theft crimes, for instance, for burglaries. And we have collected all reports at police offices for the period 2008 to 2017. Well, there's a big difference in the number of reports, of course. So the number of reports of cybercrime is much smaller than the reports of theft crimes. In itself, that could be a problem, because we know that many people are a victim of cybercrime, but they are reluctant to report it at police offices. Well, of the reports of cybercrime that are registered by police officers, just the vast majority is not taken up by the public prosecutor. That's the same for non-digital theft crimes. But the difference with cyber crimes is that the relative share of reported cybercrime that's taken up by the public prosecutor is much smaller than in the case of theft crimes. So there seems to be a asymmetric enforcement of crime. So of course, cybercrime and theft crime are different types of crime, no doubt. And in practice, it may be more difficult to obtain the relevant evidence in a cybercrime case. And perhaps those differences partly explain the differences that we are seeing here. But still, these charts suggest that the enforcement of cybercrime and non-digital theft crime is unbalanced. And given this, and also given the increasing digitalization of our lives, this is something that deserves attention. So as I'm now nearing the end of my presentation, I would like to critically discuss two common wisdoms or popular myths. And for this particular slide, I must gratefully acknowledge the insights of Professor Michel van Eeten of TU Delft. So the first common wisdom is this. It is that because of the increasing digitalization, we also have a higher risk of a serious societal disruption. So why do I disagree with this common wisdom? Or what is my critical reflection? Well, first, let me start by noting that we still not have seen a real disruption, not even after 3 decades of exponential digitalization. And okay, I'm sorry for the poor economics joke, but yes, we see computers everywhere, except in mortality statistics. So what I think is the fallacy behind this common wisdom is that technologies are additive to aggregate risk. But that's just wrong. If every new technology or new infrastructure adds to the pool of risks, then we would now live in the riskiest times ever. And I don't think that's what we are seeing now. And secondly, note that a digital disruption is not the same as a social disruption. Yes, a hack at a firm can seriously impact the operations of that firm. But of course, so can a natural disaster or a strike or an accounting scandal. We have seen many accounting scandals before that have crippled firms. What matters is how that firm or society responds to that shock. And most often, there are trivial or obvious responses already available. One of the proposals that's made to lower the perceived risk of social disruption is a public digital response team. And this is supposed to be a team that can step in when a vital process is hacked. But I think that's just a crazy idea. So a team of outsiders is very unlikely to have the information required to be of any help. It is more likely that those outsiders are getting in the way of the hacked firm's own IT team. And the second proposal is a detailed response team, a detailed response plan. Well, will that help? So what is a response plan? It's a plan that formalizes what will happen in which situation. The problem is that in real crisis situations, those situations are likely to be different than expected. And the people who are involved may not know in which situation they are. So therefore, a formalized response plan will lower the scope for creativity, initiative, and ultimately resilience. So having hopefully busted this myth, let's move on to the next one. So this wisdom is, what I'm saying here is mostly based on an analysis we wrote for a C2B report. Well, true. Several organizations warn that economic espionage believed to be done by Russia, Iran, or China is a major threat for the Netherlands and other knowledge-intensive economies. And it's true that there have been credible newspaper reports of theft of IP by people linked to those countries. But these are anecdotes. And to know with more certainty that this claim holds, we need more than just anecdotal evidence. The main argument against this common wisdom, however, is based on economic reasoning. So let's start the reasoning at the level of the evil country. As an evil country with a thirst for knowledge, you have several alternatives to economic digital espionage. You could simply buy the product, or you could hire or educate smart people, or you could fund local R&D. The problem with IP theft is that it is difficult to profit financially from it. It is more difficult to develop it into a marketable product. Why? Well, you cannot hire outside researchers and you cannot engage in open innovation tools. And secondly, when you steal IP, the original owner still has the IP in the epistemic, legal, and economic sense. The original developer is much better placed to profit than you are, because he can patent the IP or develop the product faster. So these economic considerations suggest that economic espionage is, from the perspective of the evil side, not very, very profitable. It could, of course, still be rational when the stealing country has non-financial objectives. For instance, a desire to build or to know more about the most advanced weapons. So digital economic espionage should not be viewed as a threat for Dutch firms, but it could be a true geopolitical risk. Okay, let me conclude. I hope I've convinced you that the field of economics of cybersecurity is an exciting field, and that economics provides a useful lens. And it is my hope for future research that it will devote more attention to two things: more attention to data and data sharing. And I would welcome a credibility revolution. I haven't discussed causal effects papers here, and that's because there are not that many papers that have a credible design or study a relevant topic. So relative to more mature fields, such as the economics of labor or education, there really is a big deficit in our understanding of the causal effects of security measures or policies. So hopefully in 5 years or 10 years, we made a lot of progress in this respect. So this was my last slide. I'll give the floor back to you, Laura, and I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Bastiaan, for this very interesting presentation with a lot of food for thought. So I have some questions, but we'll postpone that to the last part of this meeting. And we move on with the second speaker, Abhishta.
Thanks, Laura. I will try and share my screen. I hope most of you can actually see my presentation and hear me. Okay, great. I can see the thumbs up on the side, so thank you. Thanks, Laura, for inviting me for this talk. First of all, a disclaimer, I'm not an economist. I am a son of 2 economists, so I do know, I tried very hard to stay away from economics for most of my life, and here I am presenting to the Royal Dutch Economic Association. So I did very well on that part. So whatever I'm going to discuss with you today was part of my PhD thesis, started 7 years plus ago, and my research thereafter. I do see both my supervisors in the call as well. So Bart and Reinout, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to talk a little bit about measuring the economic impacts of cyber attacks. Maybe a nice segue from the previous talk, because we heard a little bit about we don't need anecdotal evidence, we need bit more than the anecdotes we look around. And I completely agree with a lot of points that Bastiaan actually picked out. If you want to reach out to me, feel free to email me at any point. My motivation for studying the economics of cybersecurity is simply, no matter how cool the technology is, somebody needs to pay for it, right? So companies every now and then would ask, okay, what if I invest that $1 into security? What kind of return on investment can I actually expect? And it is not clear to most companies. If you go and ask small and medium enterprises, probably they will tell you that they have other priorities to invest in before security. So there are other things they would like to get done rather than paying for security. And to understand this, I think economics of cybersecurity does provide a very good lens, and that Bastian already highlighted. Let me define what I mean by a cyber attack. So usually I try to differentiate in the type of cyber attacks that we actually see. So usually there are three security goals. Whenever you employ security, you either want confidentiality to be intact, you want integrity to be intact, or you want the availability of systems. These are all three different properties and would provide you different types of benefits as a firm. So it's very important whenever we talk about security investment, we also talk about, okay, which security goal are we actually investing in? And usually whenever people actually invest into security, the benefit of that security investment is probably the cost they might save when they get attacked or if they get attacked. So imagine you invest a lot of money into security and you never get attacked. Wow. In that case, it would be hard to show what the return on investment of that security is. How can you measure that? How can you, is there actually a framework that can help you look at these costs? So quite some time ago, and in 2013, there was a framework about measuring the costs of cybercrime in general. And they said, okay, we are going to look at the direct losses, indirect losses that a company can have, and the defense costs, because they also become part of the losses if in case the cyber attack actually becomes successful. Imagine you invest a lot of money and still the cyber attack was successful. Then what? So in all those cases, such a framework is quite helpful to provide some form of a baseline, which you can actually use in order to calculate these kind of losses. At the end of the day, what companies want to know, what is their return on investment? The most simple way to answer that question would be, okay, what would they have lost if in case there was nothing in place? And divided by the amount of investment they actually made. So that kind of gives them an idea of what costs they have saved due to the investments they have made into security. Well, these are quite simple tools that companies can use. They can estimate what kind of return on investment they had on their security investment, and so on and so forth. Well, at the end of the day, when researchers go out and try to study what were the benefits of security, or in general, what were the costs of security events that happened around the world, the first thing that comes to our front page of newspapers probably is the amount of money companies actually lose due to security. So $1 trillion are lost in the global economy due to security attacks. And those kind of big numbers make us think, well, probably these attacks are happening to everyone, just like Laura. And Laura came up with the idea that it's going to be a zero damage. So if I was a researcher going and asking Laura, how much did you lose due to cybercrime? Probably the report would be zero, right? Now, the problem with such a methodology of calculating what is lost due to cybercrime in general is that if you go and ask people what they don't know, because yeah, they are not sitting and calculating all the time what a cyber attack costs to them, they're bound to tell you whatever the perception of the current answer is. They are not really measuring it. And at the end of the day, you end up in a situation of trying to measure the elephant and you are kind of blind, and whichever part of the elephant you touch, you think that the shape of the elephant is only that part. So it's a perception game which people end up with. A very, very recent and way too recent study by Cormack and Hurley, which got published actually last month, showed that an average American is at risk of losing $6.87 annually from 6 different cybercrimes that they actually studied. Feel free to go and check out the study, what they did. Of course, it's within the context of those 6 cybercrimes. But this is something that Cormack, Elisa have been doing for quite some time now. So what is a different way of calculating these costs rather than going and asking people? And that's what I try to do, basically. So is there an alternative method of actually measuring this stuff? Well, in case of all different type of cyber attacks, probably we don't have enough instruments right now. But in one attack in particular, that is DDoS attacks, I will talk a little bit about it more in future slides. We have certain tools in place that we can reuse. We use those tools to measure the threat of attacks. Sometimes we can even measure what the impact of those attacks are. And that's the 2 case studies I'm going to share with you today. The first one is based on event studies. Laura did tell me event studies are outdated. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to quote Laura on that, but it's something we did in the very beginning of us. We wanted to just check how investors actually look at cyber attacks and think, okay, whether or not they should pull out their investments. So, well, DDoS, our hypothesis basically was DDoS attacks may have some implications on the stock price of the company. If DDoS attacks, now a question in this community might be, what is a DDoS attack? So let me first take care of that. So it's basically a denial of service attack. Imagine there's a victim, so there's your computer, and a visitor wants to access whatever website you're hosting on your system, right? Now, if an attacker sends way too much traffic towards your system becomes unavailable to that visitor. Now, this is a simple problem to fix in case of denial of service attacks. If there's a single IP address sending too much traffic towards your computer, you can just block that IP address and then your system becomes available again. But attackers are kind of also smart. So they don't do it from a single IP. They basically leverage an army of computers to send a lot of traffic towards your system, thus making your system unavailable. And thanks to the exponential growth in IoT devices, we have kind of seen attacks which are quite substantial enough to bring down the cloud services. And one of the case studies is also based on that. So I'll share a little bit about that. At the end of the day, what denial of service does is basically cause unavailability of services to the intended person or company. So yeah, it's in some cases, if it's a short-term unavailability, probably it's a little bit of, challenge for people to do something else during that time. So, but if it's a long-term unavailability, then what? And if it's a company like Amazon, which is unavailable, then what? Those kind of questions are also couldn't probably be answered just by a simple survey. So what we try and do first is to look at investor reaction to these kind of events. So when a DDoS attack is announced in media, how do the investors actually respond? So what we do is we take an estimation period, we take an event period. Probably most people in the audience understand what an event study basically does. And we try to model the stock price using a very simple market model equation. And based on that, we, try to fit a regression equation and finally calculate the cumulative normal returns for that. What is interesting is what we find when we employ these event study methodologies to 35 different announcements of DDoS attacks. That, well, the impact on the stock price, if any, is very short-lived. Most companies actually get back the money within 5 days. And it sometimes actually depends on what type of a service the company was actually providing. And that kind of makes sense, right? If a company's future value is not impacted by downtime of IT services, why would an investor actually pull out the money? Or thinking about a rational investor in that case, right? So we wanted to dig a bit deeper about this, whether we can actually see and empirically measure this kind of difference in each industry sector, how they actually respond to unavailability on bigger numbers, just not through this inference method. So moving on to that, I'm going to discuss a second case, which is based on Dyn. So Dyn used to be a company which used to provide DNS services to other companies. So they basically provide B2B services, right? They help you keep your services online. How? Well, if you see this is kind of a diagram which tries to understand how internet actually works. So when you go to your browser, so you are basically sitting here, you go to your browser and you type in www.google.com, your computer actually doesn't understand anything. It needs an IP address to go to a location, right? And there's a service on the internet called the domain name service, which actually tells you what that IP address is. And it's a decentralized service so that it can handle a lot of load, it can be more resilient, all the things that people thought about when they were designing the internet, basically. And these domain name services are of two types. One, who say, well, we will host your domain name and we will provide responses, but we don't guarantee anything, right? We guarantee that we will be up and running most of the time. You don't need to pay us, but we will try to provide you the best possible service, but we don't guarantee anything. But there are these special DNS service providers, someone like Dyn, who say, well, we are cloud-based. We are decentralized. We are going to provide you fast response. We are going to keep your services up and running even though when we are attacked. But for our service, you will have to pay a little extra, right? So that's the kind of a company Dyn was. So there is an added value that they are offering to their customers. And they were actually promising service availability, albeit there is a DDoS attack, right? What we wanted to see that when Dyn goes down, so in 2016, there was a huge DDoS attack on Dyn and its services went offline. During that period, we wanted to see how the customers of Dyn actually react. Now, how do we know who's the customer of Dyn? Well, we didn't knock on every door and ask whether you are a customer of Dyn or not. We basically leverage an active DNS measurement setup in order to do that. So what we do there is basically get lists of each in .com, .net, .org, and several different CCTLDs. We get basically all the domain names that are registered. We ping those domain names and we store whatever information we get. And there you can actually see whether the DNS service is provided by Dyn or is not provided by Dyn. So to give you an estimate of the number of domains that were using Dyn on the day of attack, it was round about 168,000 domain names on the day of the attack within the .com, .net, .org top level domains, not any of the CCTLDs which we are measuring. And what you can see in this picture is how the number of domains reduced when the attack actually happened. So this, within the blue zone, you can actually see the response of those domain names after the attack. And what we primarily see is out of this 168,000 domain names, 88,000 domain names were kind of only using Dyn. They don't use any other service. So when Dyn goes down, they basically lose their online availability. And those are the primary ones which actually respond. They change their status, they either go to another service or they start using two services at the same time. So what we are basically measuring there is the additional cost that such an attack levies on the customers of the victim due to the attack. Yes, I agree. These are not huge number of companies, and that begged another question. Why? Why is it so that so many companies are probably online during the time Dyn was down, but only 1,700 or 3,000 in total companies actually respond to it? So that kind of re-emphasized, well, we need to look into the properties of these companies, how big they are, how many visitors do they have, or if the industry sector they belong to has an impact on the type of decision they make. Well, if we do a very simple analysis, we can actually estimate that within a day of attack, 2,000 plus domains nearly stopped using Dyn on the day of the attack. Well, but as I said, we need more context about it. So recently, what we did was we started looking at some of the ranking ways. So basically the Alexa ranks to classify these websites, which were using Dyn one day before the attack. And we tried to see whether higher ranked websites were more likely to take an action. So what you see here in this plot is basically if the website belonged to the top 100 websites in the Alexa rank, then there was actually a higher probability that the website responded. These are all empirical probabilities. And as you go down in the ranking, the probability of a website actually responding reduces. So we do show that popularity of websites actually has an impact on whether or not they care about unavailability of their services. But what about the next question? The next question was whether industry sector also plays a role. So what we do is we use an automated classification service for nearly 100,000 of these domains, and we classify them based on industry sectors. And we try to see whether or not the industry sector actually makes sense. And here is a list of 20 different industry sectors that we found were actually more prevalent, there was more probability of them to respond to such an attack. So they care probably more about unavailability. Now, again, this is just anecdotal evidence because it's based on one attack. What we are now looking forward to is actually using such a methodology for multiple attacks and then seeing how the customers of the victim or how victim themselves respond and how the properties of those victims actually play a role in what kind of decisions they make. So that's basically the two ways that we try to answer the same questions which surveys have tried to answer in the past, but with slightly different twist. Thank you so much for listening to me. Questions after the next presentation, probably. Thank you.
Thanks, Abhishek, for your interesting presentation. Then we move on to the last speaker, Ralf Verhoeks. Ralf, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I am just trying to share my screen. So hopefully you see it and you hear me.
Yep.
Nice. Okay, cool. Thanks for the invitation as well for this Economencafé, to say it like that. My presentation is about systemic cyber risk. After having had two presentations about the economics and financial markets impact of cyber risk, my role is to talk a little bit more about the systemic impact of cyber risk. And compared to the previous presentations, my presentation will be a bit more practical and less theoretical. So in that sense, I think we have a nice landscape of different approaches. So the main question in my presentation will be to what extent cyber risk is not only a risk for individual, let's say, financial institutions, but also for the system as a whole. But let me first introduce myself. My name is Ralph Verhoeps. I work at the Dutch Central Bank. And I work there as a policy advisor at the Financial Stability Department, which means that I do not work for the supervision department or for payments. But these departments also have a very important role when it comes to cyber, of course. But as I said, I work at the Financial Stability Department. And our role is actually to analyze systemic risks, which means that this concerns risks that are relevant for the financial system as a whole. And we are also responsible for the calibration of macro-prudential policy. So, for instance, systemic bank buffers and things like that. As I said, the main question in this presentation will be how cyber risk impacts the financial system. First, I will briefly sketch the context of cyber risk, which is mainly the digitalization, which was also covered by previous presentations. Second, I discuss some characteristics of cyber risk, how it differs from other risks that are relevant for financial institutions that we as DNB supervise. Because cyber risk is very distinct from other kinds of risks when we compare them with more, let's say, traditional risk categories as credit or market risk. After that, I will discuss a bit more broadly the vulnerabilities of the financial sector when it comes to cyber risk. And lastly, that's of course the most important question for this presentation is how cyber risks can relate to financial stability and how cyber risk can become systemic. The first thing is to start with digitalization, because I think that it needs no saying that digitalization has changed the world around us considerably, and this also holds for the financial system. I think a lot of things are now seen as a given, also by us, but during the last decades, a lot of things have changed also in the financial system, which caused things to become more interconnected as well. So, for instance, in capital markets, in the late 60s, we still only had trading in physical shares, but it has been gradually been replaced by electronic book entry securities, and since 2010, the majority of securities only exist and can only be traded in electronic form. Just to mention an example of how the financial system evolved because of digitalization. And the same happens actually on the retail side. Banks have reduced their number of branches and expanded their online banking services, and also peer-to-peer lending, e-money providers or fintech companies have started to offer their services via apps and web platforms. Which means that things have become more interconnected. Also, many parts of the financial market infrastructure, such as central clearing, settlement services, these kind of things have also become fully digitalized. Again, it needs no saying that digitalization has brought us a lot of advantages. Simply have a look at our own smartphones to make it a bit more tangible. I think for me, in any case, the number of apps on our smartphones have been exploding in the last couple of years, which is a tangible example that a lot of things bring practical advantages also for us. But at the same time, due to digitalization, the world has become more interconnected. And for me, as a financial stability economist, when things become more interconnected, I always start to be a bit nervous, or at least a bit more concerned, because if things are more interconnected, that means that any disruption can also spread more quickly and more easily through the system. But let me first discuss the characteristics of cyber risk. What makes cyber risk different from other sources of risk? Because that's an important starting point for how cyber risk can, in the end, have influence on the financial system as a whole. If you look, for instance, at a bank balance sheet, traditionally the most important risk categories are, to summarize, credit risk, market risk, liquidity risk, and operational risk. And if we look at these traditional categories of risk, I think it would be fair to say that cyber risk best fits in the bucket of operational risk, because many characteristics are similar and very different from the other ones. For instance, market and credit risk, they have a very clear correlation with the economic cycle. That means that if the economy goes down, the real economy, these risks are expected to increase as well. When the economy does worse, the credit quality of banks will go down as well, and things like that. Another difference for cyber risk is that it is hard to build models for it, because for market and credit risk, it is possible to estimate things like probabilities of default, loss given default, based on historical data. But cyber risk is much more difficult to model for financial institutions, because you could say that cyber risk is more into the tail of distributions. That means that a big and very disruptive event is unlikely, but if it happens, the impact can be very large. And finally, there are also some specific characteristics of cyber risk that make them really fundamentally different from other operational risks. And the most important ones are the scale and the speed of propagation. What does it mean? It simply means that a cyber incident, for instance, after a successful cyber attack, can crystallize and propagate through the system much more quickly and at a significantly quicker pace than other types of risks. There have even been examples where a cyber incident infected different systems in less than a minute. For instance, because of a system that has been used by very different institutions, such that if the overarching system was infected, it targeted a lot of different institutions. So especially the interconnectedness of automated information systems enables cyber incidents to spread at a very fast pace. And it's also difficult to stop with human intervention because of the interconnectedness. And the same holds for the scale of propagation. Cyber incidents have no sectoral or geographical boundaries, while other risks are often contained because of, for instance, geographical boundaries or because certain risks only happen in certain sectors. That's not the case for cyber risk. For instance, in 2018, we saw an example with MasterCard, which disrupted the ability to transfer and receive money using credit cards across whole Europe. So just an example of how the scale and speed of propagation could look like. And another example is the high interdependence that is created by the concentration of cloud services. A lot of people and a lot of financial institutions are using the same cloud services, which means that if there is a problem at such a cloud platform or a provider, a lot of different institutions are targeted at the same time. And another to finalize this let's say characteristic story, in the sense that it differs a lot from traditional operational risks, is that when it comes to cyber, there is also a different intent, of course. It means that for other operational risks, it can simply be an accidental failure or another thing which can happen, while cyber threats often come from actors that aim to cause financial harm or disruption to the financial system. So that means also that the likelihood of a cyber incident leading to prolonged periods of problems or severe losses is also different. And the latter can also be summarized in this graph. It's in Dutch, but the motives behind cyber activity also depend on the threat actor. So, for instance, when it comes to cyber criminals, they often have as a primary goal to steal funds for private enrichment or simply theft, while nation states often have a different objective, and they pursue to be destructive or to influence the country that they are targeting or things like that. So different cyber attackers or different activities, they also have different motives, and that also results in different techniques that they use. And to make it a bit more tangible, for instance, during the COVID crisis, we saw an increase of activity by organized criminals. So this the second line of this graph. Well, the geopolitical tensions that we currently see, the war in Ukraine, has more increased the first line of this figure by nation state cyber activities or cyber threats. Important to mention is why is the financial sector also a key target? Because I think we have been discussing cyber threats, cyber risk in a very broad context until now. While BNB is of course mainly involved in the financial sector. So to what extent is cyber risk relevant for the banks that we supervise, for the insurance companies, for pension funds, for the payment system? So financial market infrastructures, that's of course our main interest. And so the question is, why is the financial sector a key target of cyber threats? I think that one of the reasons is that digitalization of financial services plays a role. The financial sector is digitalized in the last decades to a very large extent, which makes it possible or vulnerable to cyber attacks. And what also is important is that the financial sector has certain key economic functions or critical functions, you could say, to support the real economy. For instance, very basic things like payment systems, lending to the real economy, to households, to companies, deposit taking and savings. These things are all seen as let's say as a given by the real economy, but they are really critical functions. So that even if just one of these functions is distorted or not possible anymore, then the real economy will suffer immediately. And the third reason is that there is a presence of high value assets, which simply attracts a lot of, let's say, criminal activity, especially from criminal groups, which is, let's say, the second line in this graph again. So organized criminals are also simply looking at the financial sector because of the availability of money, to say it like that. When we look at the threat landscape, let's say to summarize some trends that we see in supervision, that we see in doing cybersecurity tests, which I will briefly discuss later on. We see some structural trends. The first one is a very basic observation that the threat level is rising. The number of cyber attacks is increasing, but not only the number, also their intensity and the costs of cyber attacks are increasing. So if we simply look, for instance, at how much money banks have to spend to defend themselves, but also to recover when they are hit successfully by a cyber attack, these costs are increasing. So I think it's not surprising that the threat level is increasing. But also what is important is that the threat is moving upstream, which we can explain by, for instance, what I mean with upstream is that criminals or other actors in the cyber threat landscape are trying to get more upstream in the financial sector, which means that if they are successful in an attack, that they can hit the whole sector instead of just one institution. I can again mention the example of cloud providers. For instance, if Google or another provider is hit successfully and these cloud services are somehow, for any reason, not available or distorted, then that means that a lot of financial sector participants will be hit as well. So we see that cyber attacks or threats are moving upstream in the sector or in the system. And finally, it's also being more advanced. So that's also it doesn't need a lot of explanation from my side of things, because we see that the cyber criminals are getting more advanced in their techniques and in how they get into systems. So to defend ourselves against this, we have let's say a battle who's quicker in getting more advanced. To make things a bit more tangible based on recent developments and recent observation, we have seen that recent crises have further increased cyber risk. I think that the Corona crisis was a very, very clear example that cyber criminals are also using actual developments or recent developments in their cyber attacks. We are already getting used to getting at the office more often, but we can all remember, I think, that in the spring of 2020, amid very tight time constraints, the pandemic measures have forced institutions to switch to large-scale home working for a pretty long period, and that resulted in some problems which gave rise to cyber incidents. For instance, home working, especially at the beginning, required more capacity to guarantee the availability of business networks, and that came at the cost of detecting and processing the malicious activities that came from cyber attackers. So simply the availability of networks was a problem, especially at the beginning, and also the risk of digital intrusion was increasing as a result of workarounds. Especially in the beginning of the pandemic, the home working blurred the boundary between work and private life, which increased the likelihood that employees disregarded the basic digital hygiene. And for instance, there were a lot of examples that sensitive information was sent to personal email addresses or unprotected hardware. So we have seen some examples that cyber attackers were more successful due to the fact that people started to work at home and networks were not able to defend it anymore. And we have also seen that cyber attackers react very rapidly to latest developments and events because they were simply using the coronavirus as a theme for fraudulent emails or websites to capture private or personal information. And I think it needs no saying that also the war in Ukraine has given further stimulus to cyber risk. But the difference with the Corona crisis is that in this case, it's coming from nation-state actors instead of from cyber criminals. Let me quickly move on to cyber risk and financial stability, because it's important to know that a system-wide disruption caused by cyber incidents does not necessarily lead to a systemic event. For instance, if there is a widespread disruption in cash withdrawals or electronic payments, it does not really necessarily result in a systemic crisis. So I think the crucial factor here is that if the system is able to recover quickly and to absorb the shock, the cyber incident is not necessarily a systemic event. But when the cyber incident escalates from an operational event into a harm of confidence, then financial stability will be at risk. That's a very general observation, which does not only hold for cyber risk, but for crisis in general, is that confidence or trust is actually key in preventing things to spill over to the system as a whole. So that means that a systemic event not only requires a large shock or a large disruption, but it also requires amplification, for instance, in terms of bank runs, liquidity issues, or fire sales. So, especially when critical functions to serve the real economy, such as payments, interbank transfers, and things like that, when these kind of things are hit hard, then that means that financial stability is more likely to be hit as well. Sorry, this should be one slide at once, so let me see. Yeah, so this is a summary actually of how cyber risk and financial stability are related. It's maybe a bit of a complicated figure, but what it actually says that in the first step, there should be a necessary condition, to translate it in English, that the cyber incidents should happen at least at either a systemically relevant institution, so for instance, ING Bank, or a critical substance of little institution, for instance, at a lot of smaller banks. So that's let's say a necessary condition that for an event to become systemic, it should hit a lot of companies or some systemic ones. And then we have a threshold in the sense that it should either take long or it should be a substantial shock. But I think the most important thing to discuss is to become a systemic event, there should be some amplifiers or transmission channels at play to become a systemic event. So often a cyber incident starts with being purely operational, but when confidence comes at play, for instance, if there is a lot of media attention, which is negative, that means that confidence can be problematic, and in the end also financial. And these things are always interrelated, because if confidence plays a role, that could result in liquidity issues for a bank when people are withdrawing their saving accounts and a bank run could be in play, then you see that operational confidence and financial amplifiers are interrelated. And the threshold for a cyber incident to become systemic is actually, especially when different amplifiers or transmission channels are simultaneously playing a role, then the likelihood of a systemic event in the end, which is summarized in the last column, is more likely. So
you have like 1-2 minutes.
Yeah, I can wrap it up. That's cool. I think that when it comes to the transmission between the different contagion channels, this is an overview that summarizes it. I'm not going to discuss it in full, but I already gave some examples that operational channels can spill over to confidence and also to financial, and also vice versa. One particular risk that I already touched upon in previous slides is the dependence on third parties. That's also a big risk that's currently being addressed by new legislation, because these kind of parties are always not within the scope of legislation. For instance, banks are regulated a lot, while these cloud providers, those third parties, of which cloud providers are just an example, those are often outside of the scope of financial regulation. Well, there is a big concentration risk that if a cyber incident happens at one of these cloud providers or other IT providers, the financial sector will be hit hard. So that's in particular a risk for financial stability. DNB is also running a cyber stress test, which is going to be published in June. And there we look at 2 transmission channels of cyber risk in particular. And that's actually an example of what I just discussed, is that we look at operational problems when interbank payment system of target 2 is not operational anymore. And as a second transmission channel, we look at how cyber-induced losses of confidence can spark a bank run. And to summarize the outcome of the cyber stress test in one sentence, we show that these amplification channels in isolation can only lead to systemic events in very extreme scenarios. But follow-up work is needed to see how these amplification channels will work simultaneously or how they are interacted. I think because of time, I skipped this slide about TIBER, but that's a program that DNB, if someone is interested, please ask a question about it. But that's a program that we use for hacking tests. So let me wrap up. Cyber risk is increasing and becoming more advanced. That needs no saying. To summarize how cyber risk can become systemic, that's especially the case when several amplifiers, either operational, confidence, or financial, are simultaneously at work. And financial stability is particularly at risk when confidence effects are playing a role. For instance, when an operational risk is spilling over to liquidity stress. So let me leave it there. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Okay, well, thanks for your interesting presentation. I have some questions myself, but let's first give the rest of the audience the opportunity to ask questions. So you can use the raise hand button, or you can just shout or raise your hand physically. Anyone? Robert, you raised your hand.
Yes, thanks a lot. These were 3 super interesting talks. I have a short question for Bastiaan, because he was talking about the situation where there's actually over-investment in security, which I thought was quite surprising and at first counterintuitive. And then he also said that, the conclusion from that result is that we should not always support cybersecurity with subsidies or otherwise. But I was wondering, because this result about overinvestment, it seems always to go hand in hand with at least one agent underinvesting. That seems to be a necessary condition, that at least one agent is underinvesting. And so is it also the case then that policy implication is that you should try and support the weakest agent, or the one that invests least, and in this way you can sort of try and solve the whole problem, or is this mistaken?
Yeah, that's yeah. Thank you for your question. Very interesting, and I also had the same idea. So I thought, well, when there's this asymmetric outcome, is there some way that the agents can coordinate their actions? That would be optimal. So in that model, that's not possible. And in practice, it would mean that you know what everybody is doing. So you should know who is investing how much in cybersecurity. And well, at the CPB, when we try to empirically understand what firms are doing, we found it very difficult to get data on what firms were actually doing. So there was no need micro data on investments of firms. We relied on survey data, which was the best we could get our hands on. So I was also, I liked Abista's presentation because he uses computer techniques to infer the actions of firms in the cyber domain. That's I think one of the ways forward. So yeah, I agree with you, Robert, that the result is counterintuitive. For me, the lesson is that in the real world, everything is usually different than you expect it to be based on simple models. That's the message that I wanted to get across.
Yeah, so I had a question that was a bit related to this one. Maybe I should ask it now because it was also for you, or maybe also for Abist, I don't know. But you said on one of your slides that we should judge empirically whether there's over or under investment in cybersecurity. But how do you determine whether there's under or over investment?
For that, you need to know what firms are doing and how it relates causally to their outcomes. That's also part of my last slide, where I asked for more credible causal studies on what works in cyber.
But how do you decide whether there's underinvestment? I mean, you can see that there are certain costs, but what is then when is it underinvestment and when is it overinvestment?
There's I think underinvestment in two senses. The first sense is directly from the perspective of the firm. If it would be ex ante optimal for the firm to invest more, then there's underinvestment. And sometimes the firm does not know that it's investing too little in security. You could perhaps learn that after a very costly incident, when you realize, oh, if I would have done this at very small costs, then I would have prevented this terrible accident. So then clearly ex post you know that there's underinvestment. The second sense in which there is underinvestment is when you consider the system as a whole. And I don't have a satisfying answer to that question at this moment. I'm sorry, Laura. But maybe,
did you want to say something, or?
Yeah, so maybe we can also draw some inspiration, at least, from so Gordon and Loeb. I don't know if Bastian came across that model. So 2002, they came up with a very simplistic model of investing into cybersecurity. And it shows a very, very simple diminishing returns of investment, right? Even in security. So companies like Google, Apple, even if they overinvest, probably they also derive some R&D value from that kind of investment. However, if we talk about small and medium enterprises in our neighborhood, we need to know, so as Bastian said, we need to know a bit more about how much on an average our companies actually investing. And for that, you need a more appropriate measure of that as well. Sometimes you don't directly invest into cybersecurity either. If you buy a particular, if you invest in a particular operating system, it has certain security qualities which are different from the others. And you don't necessarily account for them as security investment, right? So it's extremely difficult in that sense. But maybe having even a qualitative estimate of what companies do in terms of security. So in case of more, so something like banks where regulations are really high, they have set certain basic standards that banks or financial institutions need to have. But for other industry sectors, not much.
Okay, any other questions? So I had a question myself for Ralph, because, well, prior to this event, I wrote down a question, and I think you answered it, but because it was at the end of your presentation, I think it's good to ask it anyhow. So the question I wrote down is that, well, there's an increasing role of big tech and fintech in the financial sector. And how does this affect the cyber vulnerability of the financial system? And I think if I understood one of your last slides correctly, then you say that it leads to an increase in the cyber vulnerability. Have I understood that correctly?
Well, it's hard to summarize in one sentence, I think. There are different things playing a role. I think that they play a role in the interconnectedness in financial systems. So you cannot say a very bold statement for the whole big tech fintech story, but I think you can say that somehow for some parts of this it can increase the interconnectedness. So that means that if there is a weak spot which is interconnected with parts of the financial system, then indeed it increases the financial stability risks. And also what maybe can contribute is that when it comes to regulation and supervision and those kind of cyber testing that I didn't discuss in the presentation, but those things are all targeted at banks, insurance companies, pension funds, part of the financial market infrastructures. So in that sense, that's really more into the scope of regulation and supervision than these parts of the financial system, although they become more important. So that's also a thing for improvement for future. I think that when it comes to regulation, this is more targeted at financial institutions that are already in scope. Well, for instance, I also mentioned the example of cloud providers. Those are still, although this is going to change in future legislation, but it's still relatively out of scope. So that means that cyber vulnerabilities over there, which can really hit hard in the financial system as well, are still relatively out of scope. So that's also a thing, a vulnerability or a weakness.
Yeah, so that was indeed the slide I also refer to. Yeah, so okay, well, thanks. More questions?
Maybe something for Ralph. I'm curious about and this is not directly related to your presentation, but just curious about, so how much of the cyber strategy that is there for the financial sector in the Netherlands is based on Netherlands specific risks and threats, and how much of it is more driven by the European central regulation? And
so if I understand your question correctly, as to what extent is cyber risk driven by the Dutch context, or?
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. As I said, the scale of propagation is in theory endless for cyber risk, which means that there are no geographical boundaries for cyber risk, and that means that it's definitely not something that's only playing in the Dutch context. At the same time, you have to start somewhere. So that means that, for instance, the Tiber framework was first only applied in a Dutch context, but in the meantime, we also have a European Tiber testing. So what we do see is that things are getting more international and more harmonized when it comes to the supervision of cyber risk as well, and that's I think also justified by the characteristics of cyber risk, because cyber attackers are definitely not looking at geographical boundaries. So in that sense, that's also not necessary. But I would say it's definitely an international risk, and that also means that we have to have a harmonized and integrated approach.
Thank you.
Anyone else? No? Well, then I think it's time to thank the speakers. And thank you very much for your interesting presentations. And so Robert, you will post the video. And I would also like to ask the speakers to send us your PowerPoint. Then we can also post that on the KVS site, right, Robert?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Well, that would be great to allow others to access the interesting content of this meeting. Well, it's really nice weather still outside, so thanks for sacrificing that and to come to this meeting. And hope to see you at another event in the near future. Is there any advertisement for approaching events we should make, Robert?
Yeah, there are actually 3 of them. So one is in less than 2 weeks' time. It's in Rotterdam. It's about it's called Voices in Economics, and it is about diversity in our profession and what is the current state of affairs and how it can be promoted. And then a week later, we have the annual lecture of the Royal Dutch Economic Association, and this time it's given by Nick Mulder. He will talk about economic sanctions as a tool of modern war. And so this will take place in Amsterdam. And there are also 2 interesting discussants, Gerdien Meijering and Peter van Bergijk. And there are still a few seats left. So you can follow this lecture online, but if you want, you can also attend in the lecture room. And then finally, if you have an economics paper that you would like to present, then there are 4 days left to submit it for our annual conference, new paper sessions. So please submit before Sunday. And then, mid-June is this conference, which takes place in The Hague.
Well, really timely topics, very interesting. So hope to see you at a future event, and have a nice evening. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.